everyone, and welcome to the Mindful Kids Peace Summit. I'm really excited to introduce you to Heather Stang. She is from mindfulnessandgrief.com, and Heather is the author of Mindfulness and Grief and the host of the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. She has a master's degree in and is a certified yoga therapist. She's been on our summits before and talked about this really important topic. So today she's going to be talking to us about mindfulness and grief with guided meditations to calm your mind and restore your spirit. So thank you so much for joining us, Heather, and welcome to the summit.
Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this really important event. I'm so grateful.
Thanks. And for all the people watching, Heather's very kindly given a very nice free learning resource for you, which is the Meditation for Grief course and community forum. So it's a whole course on how to use mindfulness with grief. So that's really generous of you. So thank you so much. And if you click on Heather's speaker bio, you can also learn more about her work and her websites and social media platforms and things. So Heather, tell us a little bit about, first of all, how you discovered mindfulness.
It was such a gift and so needed. I discovered mindfulness when I was in my 30s. And I know for those of you who are diagnosed with a stress-related illness called shingles. I was the CEO of a web development company that I started when I was just 26 years old, and I had not been managing my stress. And during that diagnosis, I had a wise nurse practitioner who told me to get a grip and go try yoga. And so I actually started doing yoga, and it very quickly changed my life. It took me from this ball of stress into somebody who could actually enjoy life and be kinder to myself and others. And then when I started snowboarding and broke my arm, and it was during that time that I really deepened my mindfulness practice because I couldn't do yoga. And I learned how to use mindfulness to work with physical pain, the physical pain of the break in my arm, but I also learned how to use mindfulness to work with the emotional pain, because after I started slowing my life down and paying attention to where my stress and anxiety were coming from, I found I had a lot of unresolved grief from my childhood that I've been trying to really escape and numb out in my adult life.
Yeah. So you've used it in all kinds of circumstances. So yeah, tell us a little bit about maybe how you used it to cope with some of the losses in your life and why you became involved in grief counseling.
So my first major loss happened when I was just 7 years old. And I remember my mother pulling me out of school. I was in elementary school, and telling me that my uncle had died by suicide, and this was her brother. And so, she was in a lot of pain. I was, of course, extremely sad. Several years before that, my father's brother had also died from a brain tumor. And so we were this grieving family. But I think some family members did a better job than others, and I'll give my mother a lot of credit there, for acknowledging that I was a grieving child. Because so often when we're little and we experience a loss, the focus doesn't necessarily land on us. We might receive some words of comfort, but there can be this tendency to overprotect and think that we can't handle all the information. But the reality is we're hurting too and need to find a way to express our love for the person that we've lost, no matter what age we are. And whether it's, a close family member or a friend or a pet or even a celebrity, which is one of those things that I often get asked, like why when someone famous dies do I feel sad? It's because you felt like you were attached to them. You felt like they were a role model. And while it might not be the same as a family member, we're humans.
Yeah.
And one of my teachers says, let's not think that it's, strange or odd that we feel something. Let's celebrate the fact that we are able, to care.
That's beautiful.
I know, isn't it? It's a really, really helpful. So once I got my stress under control with the yoga and the mindfulness, my work stress got under control, and I kind of discovered that I was still having, some really strong feelings from both that loss and my parents divorced when I was in high school, right before prom, and then my grandfather died right before prom, and so I didn't get to have that rite of passage because there was all this turmoil. So for those, I know high school can be really hard when we have those losses because we want to fit in and feel normal, but I felt anything but. So that was still in there. And mindfulness taught me how to comfort, how to care for myself through self-compassion. And it also taught me that I wanted to do something about my grief. And what I came up with is that I wanted to volunteer on a suicide prevention lifeline in honor of my uncle. And that, it's not easy work, but it's very rewarding work. Anybody who's listening who's ever wondered if they call a hotline, what is that going to do for them? There's going to be someone like me sitting on the other end who really cares. Like, we don't do that work, because for any other reason than that we want to make the world a more peaceful place. So how does mindfulness play into this? Part of it is that when we are suffering, on top of the suffering, like the grief, the pain, the sadness, feeling different, feeling like you don't fit in, there can often be heaped on top of that self-criticism. Like, why do I feel this way? Why am I still feeling this way? Because one of the things that happens with grief is friends or well-meaning people who don't know any better might be like, well, that just happened a month ago. Why aren't you better? Well, grief doesn't go away like that. That's not the experience. And so being mindful of your own emotions, tracking in your body when a strong emotion's about to come up, and then treating those feelings that are inside of you with kindness rather than with aversion. That's mindfulness.
Yeah, wonderful. And so, Heather, you just mentioned, that, a month has passed and you might have experienced some loss. So can you talk a little bit about grief, and does it go away or does it lessen with time? How does it work?
It changes, it transforms and shifts. And, we're really hesitant to throw a time frame on grief because it's not about the time that passes. It's about what you do during the time. And one of my favorite grief researchers actually did a study and found out that time itself only accounts for 1% of our healing. That is it. The other 99% is what you do. And so I find meditation, yoga, self-care, connecting with other people, connecting with peers who are grieving, finding ways to remember your special person, talking about them, sharing photos and stories. Those are the types of things we do that help shift grief. Again, the pain is there because you love, and it's going to be there, but the intensity of it will change and shift. So I'll give an example. When I see this all the time, and I've experienced it with myself. My stepfather died 10 years ago this year. And in, the first probably 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whenever I thought of him, I would feel either kind of this fog or numb or sad, and then somewhere along the way, I don't know when, maybe a year, maybe 2 years later, maybe 3, it's hard to pinpoint because it's a gradual progression. And to this day, I think about him and I miss him, but I also have good memories about him and can smile because I've incorporated him into my life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like finding ways to keep remembering them. One of the things that I think can happen a lot of times is other people might not be comfortable talking about your loss, especially when you're young. Again, they think you can't handle it, or, there's a lot of misconceptions about youngins and grief.
Yeah.
And, and you want to talk about them, you want to remember them. Go ahead and do that. It's okay. It's how you're going to carry them with you. And so mindfulness of your own emotions, of your own connection to that person, that's what it's about, mindfulness of relationship. And then in mindfulness, we so often talk about the compassion practices, you know,
Yeah. You
where we,
want to share those? Yeah.
where we recognize that, all beings want to be free from suffering. All beings want to be happy. All beings want some peace. That includes kids. It's all beings. And of course, grief can make us feel like we don't have a lot of peace. It brings a lot of
Yeah.
sadness.
Yeah.
But recognizing that connection you have with your loved one will endure, even if they're not physically present.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think, at some point, everyone experiences loss, it's part of the human experience. So these are great information to pass on, and great ways to help bring this topic out into the open. Because as you said, sometimes people think kids, maybe they don't want to upset them by bringing it up, or lots of different reasons. So I think this is so important. So Heather, can you tell us a little bit about what might some of the common things that people might feel when someone passes away? I know everyone's different. So there's lots of ways that people express grief, but what might we see in ourselves?
So you're right. Everybody is different, and your loss experience is as unique as the relationship you had with that person. Only two of you had that relationship. But there are some common experiences that people have. And one that I think takes many people by surprise is the physical experience of grief. You can feel like that pain in your chest, a hollowness in your stomach, muscle tension, jaw clenching. Just it can feel like your whole body has been taken over, and you can almost feel like an alien, like you're not even used to the body that you're inhabiting. And this is where mindfulness can really help, because you don't have to deal with the story of the loss to take care of the body. All you need to do is take care of the body. And so meditation techniques such as focusing meditations or mantra meditations, or a lot of kids I know like just counting their breath. Start at the number 50 and count backwards each time you exhale, and see how long you can stay with the counting. You're gonna get distracted, but you just start again and see how long you can stay with breath. And by focusing your attention on that one thing, it's going to help your body start to unwind. Some mindful breathing can help with that, making sure you get good sleep. Another thing that can really surprise people, other than just the physical sensation of grief, is the way the brain is working to adjust to this news, to this situation. And so we can become more forgetful, we can become more irritable. And I think those are two key things to think about in the schools, is that a child returning to school after a loss, and they've maybe had 3 days off, maybe a week if they're really lucky. This is not a quick experience. And so that fog, that forgetfulness, that irritability can be around for quite some time. I have a friend whose daughter was 7, and the 7-year-old's aunt died last 2 years ago, I guess. And the anniversary of the death came around, and she started exhibiting a grief reaction. But unfortunately, her teacher wasn't sensitive to children and grief. And I think of course, me, I love this little girl. So I feel like she wasn't really tuned into the fact that the child was going to be distracted and upset because of that anniversary date rolling around. So I think knowing that not only is that fog and that irritability and that sadness and grief just kind of shows up, is going to happen in the days, weeks, months after the loss, but that it's going to show up again and again on those anniversaries as well. And so being tuned into your own grief anniversaries is helpful. One thing you can do, if you're a teen or even an adult, is track, when are the losses throughout the year, so that's a time where you need to be extra gentle with yourself. That can be really helpful. And then, of course, and another thing that I think is important to note is that with grief, our relationships can get challenged, our friendships, our social circles. And so, if you're experiencing a situation where your circle of friends don't really grasp your experience of loss, that's not your fault. That's not their fault. They just haven't had that experience. But it may be helpful to see if you can find a group of people around your age that you can connect with and have some peer support, because even though it feels like you're the only one experiencing this, there's a bunch of other people in your age group who have experienced similar types of losses, and connecting with them, again, that's that mindfulness of relationship can help you feel a lot better, and you can learn from each other.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. So when a lot of people feel awkward or they don't know what to say when somebody a friend has experienced loss. So what would you recommend to students or even to the teachers to say to others when they've experienced loss?
There isn't one right or wrong thing to say. I think the most important thing is to listen and to say you care. Grief can't be fixed. It's not something that can be put back together. So I think a lot of us, when we're sitting across the table from a friend who's suffering through grief, we want to say the perfect thing to make it all better. But a lot of times what they need is just to know you're there. So sometimes, I'll say, and I'm not saying this to let it be a routine, but I really feel this, like, I know there are no words, but I'd love to give you a hug, or something like that. Be very careful with things like platitudes, which are the little short snippet things that we tell people, like, time will heal, which we know from Bob Niemeyer's research, it doesn't 1% of the time, or this too shall pass. Those types of things don't usually feel helpful when they're coming from someone else. It usually feels dismissive. So just show you care, let them know you love them, and maybe even just give them time to tell you a story about the person. What's your best memory with your grandparent? What did you love best about your mother? Let them say their name.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Heather. Do you have any specific tips or advice that for teachers if a student in their class has experienced a loss recently? What can they do to help that child?
So there's a few things that I think are really quickly accessible mindfulness-based techniques. One is if the student is feeling really overwhelmed, like emotionally charged, that's where practices like the counting the breath or the deep breathing might help reduce the suffering in the moment. If you feel like they're in a place where they want to talk about what they're feeling, sometimes going to the body first can help that discussion be a lot more clear, rather than being stuck in the story of the head. Like, where do you feel grief in your body? Where's the strongest area of sensation in your body? And so, pointing to that area will help start a conversation that isn't stuck in the past or the future, because that's, of course, where we worry, isn't it? You know, humans time travel. I thought I made that up, but it turns out it's everywhere. So mindfulness is about being in the present, but we spend so much of our time thinking about, you know, the past and what could we have done differently, or the future and what are we going to do now that they're not here? What does grief feel like right now? And what do you need right now? So body-based things. So finding a way to discern whether in the moment it's a good time to focus and take a break from strong emotion, or is it a time to actually turn towards the strong emotion in a skillful way?
Okay. Yeah, great things to share, because I think a lot of times, like you mentioned, your friend's daughter, the teacher probably didn't know what to do or just wasn't aware. So you talked about one of the myths, which is the time heals. Are there other myths or misconceptions around grief that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there's so many. You know, I think the time thing is one of them. You know,
Yeah.
another big one is that there are stages of grief. Back in the day, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some really great work with dying patients, where she observed that generally there were 5 stages that they went through. But even she said in the introduction to that book, she did not mean for those stages to be prescriptive or all-encompassing. They were kind of what stood out. But that those 5 stages have gotten kind of co-opted to, this is what you're supposed to when you're grieving. And while we love her and give her huge props for bringing this conversation into the open, she herself didn't want us to use that as a guideline. One of the most important things you can do for yourself when you're grieving is grieve your way. Grief is as unique, again, as the relationship you had with that person. So listen to your body rather than follow a prescribed way you're supposed to feel. That's kind of the opposite of mindfulness, isn't it? But there are things that we know help. And one of the things that really helps, again, back to nods to Bob Niemeyer and his research, is that making some meaning. You know, what does this mean to me? What is this? How does this impact my life? An example for me, the way I made meaning out of my uncle's death was to volunteer on the suicide hotline. His death helps me help others, but at the same time recognizing I'd rather have him than all the wisdom in the world. Making meaning from my stepfather's death. He was a photographer, and I wasn't allowed to touch his camera when he was alive. Now I take that camera everywhere, and I feel connected to him through it. And so that finding a way to weave that person's memory into your life, whether you engage in a volunteer activity that that they would have done, or whether it's just having them up on the wall in a picture and remembering how much they loved you every day. Those types of things are really really helpful. And I think another myth that's really appropriate for this age group, we talked about how sometimes if you're young, your grief can be what we call disenfranchised. So disenfranchised grief means that the grief itself isn't acknowledged because of either your age or your social standing or your developmental abilities. But the reality is, if you're able to love, you're able to grieve. Not that you're able, you will. If you love, you will grieve, sadly. And so recognizing that the relationship itself isn't what's important. And this happened to me a lot when my stepfather died, and people would come up and say, oh, he was your stepfather. Were you close? And it was kind of a disenfranchisement, because they're saying, oh, well, he was just your stepfather. And it's like, well, you don't know what the relationship was. This happens a lot with friends. So if a classmate, I hope that doesn't happen to any of you, but if a classmate dies, sometimes that can be disenfranchised too. And then, finally, another myth I wanted to mention that we did touch on was that you may not know them and feel something. And I think, with all the media that kids today are exposed to, we see pain and death that maybe my generation didn't see as much. And so if you see somebody in another town who got hurt, or maybe their house was destroyed, and I know that's not a death, but it's still a loss, or you see something and you feel something, honor that connection, honor that your heart is big enough to care for other people it's not just limited to the people you're able to actually love and hug, but we are a human family.
Yeah.
And so using that grief as a springboard for compassion for others. It doesn't have to be a sentence that you're going to be miserable the rest of your life. I think I'm a testament to that. I've had a lot of loss and pain in my life. And again, I love and miss all those people, but I'm able to live a full and happy life too. And that's the ultimate mindfulness thing, is we can have sadness and joy at the same time, or they're going to go back and forth and nothing is permanent, even sadness.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the wording of what you just said. I think it's so important for everyone to hear about this topic. So Heather, what about what teachers that are watching, how, or parents, how do they know when maybe a child needs to get some kind of professional help, or whether they could themselves help a child through their grief?
Grief is a natural reaction to loss. Humans have been able to manage their grief for thousands and thousands of years, but there are some indicators that maybe a professional could come in. Self-harm is one of the number one indicators. If somebody's cutting, or if someone's feeling suicidal, or is refusing to eat. Food imbalances, they come with grief. Like, those early days of grief, it's hard for most of us to stomach food, and then some of us will flip around and eat too much. But if it's starting to impact health, that's a time where you want to get a professional involved. So self-harm is a big one. If they are really struggling with the things that, like school, or expressing a need for help, or expressing that they feel like they're not being heard, I think that's an important time to get help too, because grief is a family system, or it's a social system. It's not experienced by just one person. And so you as a parent, if someone in your family has died, you may not have have self-compassion for you. You may not have the energy to be the support structure for your entire family. That's really hard. So that's, I think, a really important thing too, is if you feel like you can't provide the support, then help them find some. And I'm a big fan of peer support. I think finding support in your age group, a great resource for that is Dougie.org. That's the Dougie Center up in Portland, Oregon. They're one of the gold standards for children in grief. If you're in Portland, they have tons of programs, and they can help you find someone in your community that provides peer support if you can't find it through a local hospice, which, even if your loved one hasn't died from a long-term illness, your local hospice usually has all the grief resources in your area and will support you. So,
okay, good. That's great information to know. So, just before we end today, Heather, are there any more practices or specific things that you want to share that might help somebody else who's grieving, or even help themselves in that situation?
So I think a really simple mindfulness technique that I love is, I call this showing yourself mercy. And it's just bringing your hand to your heart. And this can be if you're grieving yourself, or if you're helping someone who's grieving and you don't even know what to do. You aren't sure what to say, and you can just breathe in, and you're breathing in some kindness to yourself, and you can say, this is hard, and on the exhale, but I'm doing my best. This is hard, but I'm doing my best. And that holds both as true, because, as I often joke with my grief groups, this is not finishing school. We are not here to go through grief looking like we have it all together. It's very messy. It's complicated. You don't know what's going to show up. But again, humans have been able to manage it through thousands of years. And if you're able to apply mindfulness, grieve your own way, listen to your body, show yourself mercy all the time, then it's going to be a much easier process, and you'll get to a place where you're able to assimilate that story of love and loss into your life as you continue to move forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for sharing all that great advice and so many practical ways we can use mindfulness to help us and help our students through our grief or their grief. I just want to remind our audience, Heather's very kindly given a whole course on mindfulness and grief, so you can learn lots of other techniques and information by going through that course, absolutely free. And also you can check out her book, Mindfulness and Grief, which we'll have a link to on her speaker bio. So thank you again, Heather, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Helen. I'm so grateful to be here. And thank you all for listening. Go be nice to yourselves.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
Bye.